In apartheid South Africa, just see if this sounds familiar, white Afrikaners believed that they had a right to self-determination, that the land was theirs by divine right, and separation was not oppression, it was necessary to retain the identity of their nation. The white Afrikaners saw themselves as a people who'd arrived centuries ago, tamed and modernized an empty, uncivilized land. Their conquests over the natives, they turned into legends, like the 1830s Battle of Blood River, named after the enormous number of Zulu natives that they would kill. They'd made a covenant with God. If they won, they knew the land would be divinely ordained. And after their victory, using guns and cannons, mowing down any possible defenses against their charge, from that day forth, they were convinced they were God's chosen stewards of the land, and celebrated that day, the Day of the Vow, every December 16th for over a century. Ending apartheid was unrealistic, a threat to national security. Black African resistance were terrorists, they were extremists, existential threats. People from the outside didn't understand the resistance. There was a communist element at play. This was an incompatible, uncivilized culture. And so they regularly killed protesters, even if they were peaceful, detained tens of thousands of people without trial, including children, and anybody who attacked the regime was called unchristian, enemies of the state, communist, etc. And the U.S. government, under both Democratic and Republican administrations through the 50s and 60s, maintained very friendly relations with apartheid South Africa because it was critical for our global strategic interests, helping defend against communism. And so apartheid was pretty well tolerated. Reagan, Jerry Falwell, the televangelist, Heritage Foundation, they all supported it and opposed sanctions. Over 350 U.S. companies were invested in South Africa, like Ford, Mobil, IBM, through the 1980s, contributing billions to their economy. IBM's computers were used to manage the PASS system, which controlled Black South Africans' movements. Chase Manhattan, Citibank provided loans to the South African government, and they all helped keep its economy stable. Eventually, white Afrikaners would strip millions of native Black South Africans from their citizenship, drive them into enclaves, and look, if they didn't like it, there were plenty of other African nations that they could live in. This might be sounding a little bit like modern Israel. Well, they collaborated extensively with South Africa. They had a formal military agreement. They did joint development of missile systems. Israel supplied apartheid South Africa with submachine guns and military training, and South Africa provided raw materials in return, like uranium. And today, the United States has a similar relationship to Israel as it did with South Africa, with its tech giants like Amazon, Google, and IBM, who provide the software and infrastructure used to map and monitor Gaza and the West Bank in minute detail, every village, every road, every family, over 5 million Palestinians who live under a system that some call worse than apartheid. Because even though native South Africans were denied rights, segregated, tortured, abused, Palestinians have no citizenship in any sovereign state, no voting rights, no passports, even though most of them are refugees or descendants of refugees expelled from the land we now call Israel, but they're branded as foreigners. Like South Africa, Israel claims that Arabs have 22 countries and Jews just want one. But just like Africa, most so-called Arab countries are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and were created by European colonial powers, not Arab nationalism. None of them have laws saying that only Arabs have the right to self-determination. Israel's the only state in the region that legally defines itself as a nation for one ethnic group and builds a legal system to exclude everybody else. Millions of Palestinians' lives were decimated 75 years ago to create a Jewish majority state, a people many of whose ancestors were Jewish themselves, a people who'd lived on that land not just for generations, but thousands of years, a people like every other on earth today who, if you trace back, you'll find you are related to, because all of our family trees intersect, making any attempt at stark divisions between us quickly descend into absurdity, as our similarities or differences vastly transcend any group naming conventions and the ever-changing borders of our imaginations. And now that every international human rights organization, doctors, lawyers, genocide experts, Israeli genocide experts have all called Israel's campaign of mass bombing, forced starvation, and systemic killing of civilians and children, a genocide, we can all see that this is the inevitable result of a predictable cycle of violence, the kind that occurs in an apartheid system, which will always be resisted and which will always be reinforced with greater and greater strength until it breaks. And so a comparison is now also apt with Germany in the 30s and 40s, who had in turn portrayed the Jews as an existential threat and branded their Nazi invasions of other countries as a defensive war, a holy war, a struggle for their existence. They called their so-called final solution a protective action, a preemptive necessity, and positioned themselves always as the victims. Because genocide and apartheid are always justified with this language of self-defense. Just like in the United States right now, where white nationalist leaders and their hired bounty hunters are rounding up thousands of people, non-whites mostly, foreigners, into detention camps under the banner of border security and fighting crime, in reality, torturing asylum seekers, teachers, medical workers, doctors, farm workers, scientists, nannies, elder caregivers. And meanwhile, the Epstein class, the 0.001%, who own the Citibanks and Palantirs and IBMs and BlackRocks, they've never had borders or nations or religious wars. They just struggle against one another for the greatest market share, funding all sides, hedging their bets, and gambling with the vast sums of money that represent the stolen labor of the masses, who, as long as they keep dividing us against one another in forever wars, against forever enemies, they can keep exploiting and looting and wrecking not just nations, but all of human civilization, as they inflame the atmosphere, the one around us and the one inside us, unless we boycott, divest, and sanction, as we did to topple South African apartheid, and do the same not just to Israel, the nation, but its corporate sponsors, against inhumanity everywhere. We must be relentless in this pursuit, and that's not political purity. This is our only true existential threat. Apartheid, a word that means separateness, is an illusion we maintain at our peril. It creates so much needless horror when in reality, all people are our people, all children are our children, and they're counting on us.